So we are group 5, and today we are covering copyright plagiarism and fair use law. So Ben will be going over modern copyright law. Courtney will be going over how to avoid plagiarism and more of the legal applications of plagiarism. Miles will be going over fair use doctrine, and I will be wrapping up with the ethical emphasis that we have for all of these points that we've made prior.
So let's first discuss modern copyright law. The consideration of copyright law, its boundaries and its applications are a systemic process for editors and publishers and anybody who's charged with educating or disseminating information in an ethical way. It's a centuries old. Practices have grown exponentially in the modern age to cover over the written and the spoken word, digital formats, and all its complexities. So in examining these ideas from an editor's point of view, we must consider the different areas of fair use and creative common laws to maintain a cautious approach in upholding ethical principles that should guide each job that you and your businesses undertake. So the Copyright Act of 1976 highlights several ideas that inform decisions made by the legal system in determining law and day-to-day activities inside of the business world. The number one thing we'll talk about today underneath that is fixation. Fixation is one of these facets that offer guidance in ethical decision making as an editor. Theoretically, it's a requirement to obtain copyright, and it's therefore often produced or protected by provisions in the Constitution. The law states in Section 102 that fixation is defined as any physical rendering of the fruits of creative, intellectual, or aesthetic labor. So how can you determine fixation with such a loose definition and unclear boundaries? The actual law itself is very complicated and convoluted, but it basically says that if a work is in a physical, tangible medium and can be seen and recreated for future application, that it has fixation. Authors and editors often had a better idea of the boundaries that they were dealing with, but now because of the digital age, professionally speaking, they've been muddied a little bit more, and they're often dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So in navigating 21st century digital scholarship, Heather Seabird, Rachel Miles, and Christina Gunther posit that the copyright protection issues from an editing standpoint can be viewed a little more simply through a series of question statements, such as foundationally, does the work have a copyright protection on it? Does it have an existing license? Is there a specific exemption that covers my ability or the author's ability to use it? Is it covered by fair use? And do I need specific permission from the copyright holder to use this? These questions, as well as the opportunity of using something with a Creative Commons license, are discussed in Navigating 21st. Creative Commons is another area we'll discuss that is basically an idea that's to give the world an opportunity to share its knowledge. However, it's often extrapolated and stretched to the limits of the law by different companies. If we review the very famous United States versus Google case of 2011 from an ethical standpoint, to determine appropriate boundaries as practitioners of this important facet of editing, ultimately Google tried to procure and distribute information throughout the world simultaneously using small pieces of authors' info without their explicit permission as little snippets. In Creative Commons American Moral Rights, the author Sundar Rahan says that it's our decision ultimately as representation of authorship to protect work from companies like Google, and we need to discuss their affiliations. So in understanding that, we need to protect them and elevate them on the highest levels. In this case, thankfully, Google lost that particular case, and the authors were able to retain their work in all of its integrity.
How to avoid plagiarism? Well, what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the act of stealing someone else's work to use as their own, whether that be in writing, music composition, computer code, and even various forms of art. Stealing someone else's work is wrong. As we heard in the previous slide, Ben talked about the various copyright acts and when they started, among other things. A lot of people tend to categorize plagiarism and copyright as one. Although they are similar and can go hand in hand, they are not the same. Copyright focuses on the work being distributed and copied, whereas plagiarism only applies to the idea if it's copied and used as your own. You can still commit plagiarism without getting in trouble with copyright infringement. To put it into perspective, imagine if I was to take the first line of Charles Dickens' Book of Christmas Carol and incorporate that into my own story. I would be committing plagiarism, but would not get in trouble for copyright infringement. Since the act was put in place after the book came out, making it public domain. How to avoid plagiarism? What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the act of stealing someone else's work to use as your own, whether that be in writing, music composition, computer code, and even in other various forms of art. Stealing someone else's work is wrong. As we heard in the previous slides, Ben talked about the various copyright acts and when they started, among other things. A lot of people tend to categorize plagiarism and copyright as one. Although they are similar and can go hand in hand, they are not the same. Copyright focuses solely on the work itself being copied and distributed, whereas plagiarism only applies if the idea is copied and used as to your own advantage. You can still commit plagiarism without getting in trouble with copyright infringement. To put into perspective, imagine if I was to take the first line of Charles Dickens' Book of Christmas Carol and incorporate it into my own story. I would be committing plagiarism, but would not get in trouble with copyright infringement because the book was written before the act was put into place, making it public domain. To avoid plagiarism, you must cite your work and give credit to the original author of the idea you have chosen to use. The only way to get past citing your work would be if you had knowledge that the audience that you're about to give a presentation to or write something towards knew 50% or more of the information you're about to present. And even then, it is still better to play it safe and cite your work to make sure you won't get in trouble for anything. Aside from copying others' work, there's also such a thing as self-plagiarism. This is where you take your own ideas or words from a previous published work and reincorporate it into a new one. Regardless of it, if it is your own work or not, you should still cite it because self-plagiarism is basically breaching the honesty between the author and the audience, and that's still wrong. And even if you paraphrase a book, you must still always copyright. So just cite everything just to make sure and play it safe. Committing plagiarism could land you some serious charges, ranging from $2,000 to $200,000. A lot of days in court, battling to clear your name, and even possible jail time. There are several incidents of plagiarism that take place throughout the world. A few that I found involve Oprah Winfrey, Melania Trump, and even J.K. Rowling. Although none of these cases made it very far, a few of them could have been avoided if they just cited their work and the information they got. Another example of plagiarism that is not really talked about is in the church. A few pastors have brought up the fact that other pastors copied their sermons and used as their own without giving credit to them. So they came up with an idea to post their sermons to a website where they could purchase them, other pastors can purchase them and use them. And if they overly plagiarized, then they would get their account deleted altogether. But this just comes to show us that plagiarism happens everywhere and happens more than we think it does. So just like Scott Gibson, a professor from Baylor University, said, plagiarism is kidnapping somebody else's thoughts, words, and ideas. So always make sure you cite your work and acknowledge where your research came from.
So, so now I'm going to tell you about fair use, particularly the application of the fair use doctrine, and why it's important as its place in your life as a professional. There's some examples of what's considered fair use: commentary, research and scholarship things mostly. You're going to be using it for teaching. It can be used for criticisms or commentaries. Usually it's from a published work, and it's usually a small amount. It's not a big amount. And somebody usually lawfully owns the work. Those are typically what's used in fair use stuff. It's for teaching. If you're using it to make any money, it's not going to fall under the fair use. If it's something that's been unpublished or anything like that, that's not going to fall under fair use. So also, no doubt there's conflicting messages in the fair use doctrine. How does it affect you as a professional? The Google case in 2002 about all world books being virtually digitized. the reaction of l'Académie Française. It's this department of the French government that of the French language, and they wanted access to their library. They wanted to like upload it, and uh, they were like, no, that's not fair use. That's not, you don't have the right to all that. So also there's a couple other cases. There's this Andy Warhol making prints. They had this case. He was using photographs of somebody, goldsmith, and but the way he was printing them was a new type of printing, and so uh Andy Warhol, like the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts won in the end in that case. But there's a lot of cases of sampling and covering lyrics in the music industry. And how might that have an effect on your work? Let's say, for example, as an editor for a contemporary music periodical, like you write about pop music or something, and maybe you're comparing lyrics or something. You're going to be You're going to be using those in your uh, you know in your work. But for the most part, fair use for educational purposes is working in most cases as intended, and no legislative intervention is necessary. Let's say you're just editing materials specifically for an ESL class where print, you know, just anything that people are wanting to read, anything current, is copied like verbatim to just to give the person who doesn't speak English exposure to the not, to what they want to read. That's totally fair to use that type of stuff. So let's see. So that, yeah, basically there's a lot of ethical implications that are involved with the fair use doctrines, but for the most part, if used correctly, there are many opportunities for great works of literature and nonfiction works for people to learn from that should be available.
So, throughout the presentation, we've talked a lot about the legal issues and more of that kind of jargon, those implications. But something else that has been brought up quite frequently is that this is an ethical issue. So, um, when you take away someone's rights to their intellectual property or you abuse someone else's property, call it your own, you're decreasing the value of that work because now the source is no longer your own and there isn't anything new being produced. In Sarah Pritchard's article, The Rising Rate of Plagiarism, Careless Citation Practice, Bad Grammar, and Failure to Read, and I'm not talking about the students, which is quite the mouthful of a title, she asserts that a growing number of authors are plagiarizing work, which stains the reputations of the authors, but also prevents journals from publishing new work. And what I will add to that is a lot of people are not publishing to journals, academic journals, in order to make money. You don't really make money when you publish on those forums. What they're trying to gain is reputation, just getting their name out there, specifically scholars, so that people will use your work. So when you plagiarize other people's journals, you're affecting their career, really, which is unfortunate. And again, these journals cannot publish, so new information can't be given to other scholars. In the same vein, the consumers, which are usually other academics in the example of the journal, are expecting quality work. You're being inspired to write by other people's works, but when you plagiarize and can't trust the nuance of the person um, that wrote the article that you want to comment on or use for your new article, then that makes that article um it makes the article that the person is writing not as legitimate. It causes an issue altogether with creating new research because they can't trust the articles that they're reading and are being inspired by. And in STEM disciplines, um, you could lose funding that's being used to create new stuff that's supposed to be beneficial for society And when you lose that funding, it causes, you can't put that work out there. And this is both articles that are sharing new scientific discoveries, but also physical things. If you were to create the cure for cancer and it couldn't be put out there because you plagiarized the work that contributed to the creation of that cure, that I would either delay or prevent that from being released to the public, because the people providing your funding can no longer trust you as a researcher, as a scientist, or in this case, a medical professional. So that doubt that's created can prevent new things from being put out. So those are really the two issues with plagiarism, copyright, and fair use, and why we should protect those is it stops and slows down the production of new work, that it removes the motivation for people to create work in the first place, and it takes away the work that you have put into as the author being plagiarized. It's disrespectful, it doesn't look good for the person copying, and really decreases the value of new work being put out.
So in conclusion, though the procedures of copyright fair use law, plagiarism may seem very like nothing more than like legal jargon and sporadic procedures. Conclusion, though the procedures for copyright, fair use, and plagiarism may seem like nothing more than legal jargon and bureaucratic procedures, they were created to protect authors and other creators from being unrecognized for their contributions. As professionals, it is our responsibility to maintain the integrity of authorship by educating ourselves on the possibilities of infringement in today's modern marketplace of print and digital formats, especially the editors that are the gateway to polish the final products.